Thanks everybody, and thanks for the invitation to speak today to the conveners. Thanks for the introduction. Just briefly give a bit of background on my history. I've done about 28 years actually of fauna and flora surveys and biological assessments, mostly in WA, and a lot of that's been in the northwest of the state. I'm a principal of Biota and Environmental Sciences. We're a consultancy that specialises in this type of work, so we're a relatively small firm, but we do fauna and flora and ecological assessments. So a lot of our work is really revolving around the subject of the symposium, Flora and Vegetation Surveys for Impact Assessment. And the majority of that type of work in the state is obviously done by consultants. So my perspective today is really coming from a consultant's perspective, how we comply with various guidance and some of the challenges that we have in delivering a high standard of assessment. I know this has been covered off on by some other speakers today and will be touched on by others as well, but I thought I'd just briefly recap some of the legislative and policy frameworks that we respond to. And within WA, that's very comprehensive. We have quite a well matured and sophisticated framework for expectations of surveys and impact assessment, and it's a product of the long-term development and investment by the regulators in the state. So it's not an accident that WA has such a high standard of assessment requirements. There's been really significant changes in the last few decades, particularly with the advent of the native vegetation clearing regulations. That captured a lot of local and incremental impacts that were going on flora and vegetation in the state that were previously going unassessed. So that's sort of death by 1,000 cuts of lots of small clearing proposals that no one was looking at. In particular, the subject for today, I guess, has probably been talking about this guidance as well, the EPA's technical guidance on flora and vegetation surveys. That has been through a couple of iterations and substantial improvement, and is now one of the primary policy frameworks that we respond to with doing this type of work. And also I believe the last talk was regarding the new Biodiversity Conservation Act and the regulations and the requirements of that Act, and particularly the expectations that are now placed upon people doing flora and vegetation surveys for impact assessment, both in terms of the actual scope of the work, but the reporting requirements in particular for threatened species, threatened communities, that type of thing. But really for us as consultants and practitioners doing this type of survey work, we need to make sure what we're undertaking is reliable and actually has the content in it to adequately meet these expectations and not just have the appearance of that, but really be a robust technical assessment that provides the right inputs then to EPA and the other regulators in actually conducting the final determinations of proposals that impact flora and veg. So I wanted to go through a few different themes today about some of the challenges for botanists in doing this type of work and producing a good end product. And one of the first ones, which most of us have probably encountered, is proponent expectations or proponent understanding of what's required. That's quite variable. And it's incumbent on us as practitioners to really understand the expectations of the regulators and fully get our head around what the legislation is saying we need to do, what the policy documents say, what it is we're supposed to be responding to here. And most of us that have done this type of work know a lot about the realities of fieldwork and the myriad ways in which it can have an impact on what you're doing, whether it's compromising the time you've allowed for the survey, various things that can go wrong or things you didn't expect. Important factors then that we have to consider after the survey in terms of how we're then dealing with the data and the specimens that have been collected. Commercial pressures are a real thing for consultant botanists, particularly in this state now after the end of the mining boom. And finally, just to touch on, are there any other things we can be doing to give us fuller, actual true impact assessments and a better understanding of what the impacts are on flora and vegetation. So just firstly, in terms of proponent expectations, this is a very broad generalisation, but the expectations and understandings of proponents can really vary significantly, and often that's to do with the size of the organisation that's proposing the new development, and whether they have in-house personnel or not that know about flora and vegetation surveys. So broadly speaking, we can have two types. We've got Rex here. He's pretty much a nice guy. He's green, or he wants to be green. And then you have this other fellow down here, Joseph, we'll call him Mr. Banks, and he knows quite a bit about plants and quite a bit about flora and vegetation. Typically what you see is the understanding of the Rex end of the spectrum is pretty limited. So they don't know a lot about flora and vegetation. They may well have been told they've got to do something. They probably don't know that there's survey guidance documents out there, etc. And whereas the other end of the spectrum, the well-informed proponents, usually know all about that already. You don't have to tell them, they know what they're doing. They may well be undertaking surveys in advance or commissioning them in advance. The other aspect that typically goes along with that then is the specification or the scope that that client wants you to do. With the REX end of things, usually it's pretty broad. They're just saying, I need to do a flora survey, someone's told me that. At the other end of the spectrum, and it's usually the larger proponents, they usually have quite a prescriptive survey scope. They'll be telling us in detail exactly what it is they want done. So there's two kind of implications that come out of that depending on which type of client you've got, if you're a botanist doing this type of work. With the first category, or the top end of the spectrum there, really your role is to inform and advise that proponent about what it is they need to be doing. They probably don't know, and they're going to need to be educated to a large extent about what the requirements are. That also means you're carrying the primary responsibility for scoping what needs to be done for this impact assessment survey, advising them about the likely pathway it might take through the assessment process, and really determining what the expectation is going to be from the regulators for this guy's proposal. With the other end of the spectrum, usually the well-informed proponents already know about that stuff, and they're often carrying responsibility for getting approval in place. So that part's a little easier, but typically then they'll often have their own sort of data standards and survey guidelines. They may have their own protocols they want to see followed for vouchering. So as a consultant botanist doing work with that type of proponent, you may end up in situations where you're trying to rationalise their guidelines with what the EPA guidance is. So it's not as straightforward as necessarily just following the policy documents from government. Either way, whatever sort of proponent you've got, you really need to be critically reviewing what's being asked for and what we're proposing to sort of meet that requirement. And the key question is it going to meet the regulator's expectations? Is it going to provide the data that's necessary to deal with this type of proposal on flora and veg and work out what the impacts are going to be? And of course, most proponents have this expectation of value for money. So overlaying on all that is that the budget has got to be kept fairly low if you want to actually do the work at all from a commercial point of view. So that's some aspects that go along with proponents. Another key one which can affect the quality of the data coming out of surveys is timing. 2 points which are both there, and these are usually driven by proponent side issues. They may request surveys in a bioregion that are outside of the optimal season. That's a very common one. And often then they say, I need the report 2 weeks after you come back. So well, I've got 1,000 specimens to identify, and then I've got to do some analysis and all the mapping to do, etc. I'm sure everybody who's a consultant here has had that. And if we come back to our friends Rex and Mr. Banks here, we've got more likely that you're going to get requests that are out of season because they just don't know at one end of the spectrum, and perhaps less likely at the far end. But that's not always the case either necessarily. Sometimes the environmental staff in the big companies are being told by people who are not biologists or environmental scientists that they need to get this approval in place by a certain time. So how we respond to this sort of thing, if you don't have a bumper season like the photo at the bottom there, then what do? Well, we have to advise them about requirements for an adequate survey. What do they actually need to do? That might be another phase, or it might be some other work that needs to be done in a targeted sense. And if they can't delay, ideally we'd be waiting, but if they can't do that for their own project reasons, then what extra work's going to be needed to supplement limitations? What are going to be the limitations so they understand that right up front? Similarly with the delivery timing, providing them with feedback, whether it's the REX end or it's the other end of things, on what's realistically required is important, I think, because it's partly an ongoing education process, incremental process that goes on with proponents and industry more broadly about the amount of time and effort that's needed to deliver high quality flora and vegetation surveys. And that part of that is then identifying to them the risk of not extending their timeframes to allow a reasonable period for IDs and for analysis and mapping and then some quality reporting based on that. But if you don't do that, the risk is you're going to get a flimsy assessment and the regulators will send you back and you'll have to go through the whole circuit again, etc. It's a waste of money, time, etc. So important thing to provide them with feedback on. So there are a few things to do with proponent side, but from our side of things as practitioners, some things are really important for us to understand to deliver a real high quality product. we and you, the botanists out there, need to thoroughly read and understand the current guidance and regulations. So it's incumbent on us to keep up with what all the changes are. That's both from things like subscribing to EPA's website, reading all new current policy, coming along to events like today, so that our knowledge is good advice and current advice, so we know what we're supposed to be doing when we go out in the field. You don't want to come back and find out later, oh, I didn't do something that was supposed to be done, and you're trying to patch it up afterwards. And if you're not certain, then you absolutely should seek some advice on somebody who's more experienced in the field, whether that's internally or if you have an external mentor, somebody outside of your company that you work for. And it's also advisable to consult with the regulators about specific requirements of your survey. Obviously that depends a bit on the sensitivity of the proposal and the location. If it's small scale and the framework for the assessment is very clear, that's probably not necessary. If it is somewhere sensitive or it's somewhere you haven't worked before, then it is advisable, and it gives you some comfort that what you're doing is correct. And again, it's better to have that advice now rather than after the survey. I think as well, from our side of things, if you're not familiar with the region or the locality or the flora, then you need to do your research and make sure you get up to speed on what's going on in that area, and make sure you apply the guidance from that framework. So once you know about the area, revisit the guidance and see what we're supposed to be doing. And when you're deciding your surveys up front, it's important to be realistic about appraising the vegetation diversity that's there. What existing data is there you can draw on? Is it a really rich area? Are you expecting lots of vegetation types, or is it pretty homogeneous and not that exciting? Because that helps you work out what effort's needed, how many quadrats you're going to need, how long is it going to take. All those things are really important. And if you go in blind from the start, or you under scope from the start, then you're setting yourself up for a poor quality product out the end. I mentioned about realities of the field. A lot of these photos are from the Pilbara, but there's similar issues in the southwest or the Yilgarn. It's just a few factors that commonly come up when you're doing field work for flora and veg surveys. One is the scale of the survey area. You can be asked to tackle some really large areas, so just getting around in these places is difficult. And making sure you've got an adequate coverage of the range of veg types, the diversity of the flora that's there, can be really challenging just to get the on-the-ground coverage. So that informs how many botanists you need, how long you need, how many additional phases of sampling might be required. Actually getting around, what's your access like? Can you actually get to some of the spots you want to get to? Are you get bogged getting there? The sort of things that happen routinely in the field. Can you drive around? Do you need a helicopter? So sometimes these sorts of things come up in the design of the survey, and it's better to know about that before you head out on site. Otherwise, again, it can lead to inadequate survey data. The weather's important, and we all like to think it's going to be like that when we go out for our field trip, nice and sunny, beautiful weather, but in practice often it's like this. And so you can get some unpleasant conditions to be working under, and that just makes everything more difficult. So these factors can compound up. It's hard to get around, your specimen management's more difficult, you're trying to dry your plants, all that stuff. It's harder if you get unpleasant weather. And related to all of that, safety is obviously vital with remote area surveys, but it does have big implications sometimes for your time that you've got available to do sampling, the logistics, how you're getting around, are there client safety expectations you have to meet. So you might find that your 10-day field trip becomes only 6 or 7 days of effective survey time actually collecting data. So all these factors can combine together in terms of how the field trip runs. So those are mostly external factors, if you like, about working in the field, but for botanists ourselves, we need to know about certain things in the field. Our skill base has to be adequate to conduct that survey, and I've just picked out two things here. One question is, how adequately can you delineate the veg types that you're looking at in an area? So do you know this area really well? The answer is probably yes, you can delineate them well. And the second question when you go to any new survey area is, how well do you know the flora of that area? Be realistic about it. Within each of those points then, the first one is really important because it's a key driver of how much sampling effort you've got to put in, how many quadrats you're going to need. If you go out there and you can't really distinguish how many veg types there are, how is it that you're going to think you're going to meet the guidance? You need to understand that so you can design your sampling effort. And that's both looking at aerial imagery and being able to interpret that, but also looking on the ground. And that's fundamental to later impact assessment as well, of course, in its own right, because the veg mapping and things like threatened community extents, that's all used spatially for the actual impact assessment when projects are imposed on the top of that. So it's important that you've picked all the veg types at the right level of synthesis. Second point about how well you know the flora is important for the within quadrant sampling adequacy. So you really need to be devoting sufficient time to adequately sample each of your quadrats. So when you go to a site, you have to keep an open mind and be precautionary about what you're seeing there, and that's got to be reflected in your collecting of specimens. It's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, I've seen that 1,000 times, I know what that is, I don't need to get one. But if you're not working in an area you know that well, that may well... is that good? Right. Then you can easily undersample. And that also applies obviously to rare species, case for conservation significance. You need to know where they occur on the ground, or if you're in a particular habitat, what species might you expect. Key considerations after the fieldwork. These are mostly around rigour in data and specimen management, because fundamentally getting a good report at the end comes from really solid and robust data management and specimen management all the way through. So that's your actual specimens, the related data, your mapping notes in the field, how you manage the specimens so they're in good condition for IDs, because quality of specimen IDs, again, is fundamental. You need to know that what you've done is completely identifying everything as accurately as possible and adequately as possible, because that feeds into the floristic analysis that then informs the actual assessments. So if you've done some fairly ordinary IDs, really the analysis has got very little value, and then the subsequent veg mapping and the data QA and documentation is also probably going to be substandard. Whereas if you've paid attention to these things all the way through the process from the field, then they'll be of similarly high standard. Of course, there's a lot of commercial pressures on consultants, as I mentioned, and really when it boils down to it, that's about budget and keeping the price down so you get the work, and that can only impact on the quality of surveys. You can't help it. And there's a few ways in that can happen. So poor old Mr. Banks here is a botanist now, he's trying to do a good job. He's got a lot of pressure on him though, and some of those are things like complete the fieldwork in less time because then your price is lower, or use those experienced botanists because they're cheaper, or even non-botanists in some cases. And it leads to an increased risk of undersampling, either because there's pressure to keep the time down or whatever it is, but within quadrats you'll probably have less specimens collected, more assumed IDs, as I mentioned, and probably also undersampling at landscape level. Veg types get lumped that should have been separated, so there's less quadrats, etc., etc. So that leads to a risk of lower quality flora IDs from any given survey area, and a reduced adequacy overall of impacts to EIA decision making. So if we sort of buckle to this pressure, or we're tempted by these options, if you like, then you end up much more like Mr. X again instead of Mr. Banks. So for consultants as an industry, just to close off, I think I've probably got like 2 minutes left, or 1 minute. I really think we need to resist the temptation or external pressures to underscope requirements for surveys. It just leads to poor quality products, and it's risky for you and for your clients. And that might be, if you're a small business, you're making decisions, so the temptation is there for you to say, well, I'll just cut this down and keep it lightweight and we'll win the job. But I think that's a slippery slope. If you're in a large firm or a big company, then you may get pressure from within your company to keep the budgets down, and people who don't usually understand what's required within the business may be saying that to you, not to pick on engineers, but often the big engineering firms can apply that type of pressure to internal botanical people. I think in general, a challenge that we're thinking about for us and for the regulatory people here is that our sampling at the moment is still very much inventory focused. So that's really important, obviously, because we want a full inventory and we want to be able to identify community types. So it's critical to the EIA process, but it doesn't tell us much about ecological processes or actual impact pathways. And sometimes when you get to the end of the EIA process, that's the questions that are being asked. It's like, well, there's dust going everywhere. Is that a problem for this community type? I don't know. I think also, I didn't want to talk too much about data sharing, because every one of these things I go to, everyone's going, data sharing, share the data, share the data. But it is really important, and things like the new IPSA initiative and some of the larger proponents in town are also reaching data sharing agreements. That's critical for contextual analysis and floristic analysis that actually makes the most of all the survey work in the region. And really, without that sort of data sharing, things like cumulative impact assessments are virtually impossible to do. And finally, I just wanted to put it out there that there's lots of highly motivated people that work in this field who genuinely want to improve the standards and deliver really high quality outcomes for EPA and high reliability information. So I encourage everybody in this room who works in this field to continue doing that. Thanks very much.
So one thing we must do.
One thing.
You get one. One
Oh,
critical.
I just gave you like about 20.
No.
I could pick one of those things. What would it be? Allow enough time to sample adequately. How's that? It's a theme capsule.
I was just wondering if you'd seen this downward pressure on anti-fauna sampling and what zoologists have done to sort of defend the keep or defend the pack so we don't see that. Obviously, you don't experience so much of that sort of traction, budget pressure. So.
Yeah, exactly the same things going on the fauna side of things here, sorry to say. And there's been an increasing trend towards more targeted fauna surveys plus level 1 work rather than comprehensive level 2 sampling. And some of that's from proponent side, but some of it's also from consultants trying to get the price down. So there is that combination of pressure and temptation, if you like, that's happening on the same side of things.
So nothing's in line.
Looking for innovative ways of still collecting well. I guess there's been a bit of that going on the fauna side. So you're getting good quality data, but you're not necessarily doing the full survey. And identifying cases, sometimes it's not needed to do a huge survey, comprehensive survey. It might be an area that's really well sampled. So if you find one of those spots, and it's the same for Flora&Veg, you may well be able to get away with less. So those sorts of balances of existing information being adequate and keeping your price down is a much better way of doing things from a commercial point of view. And I guess also push back from the regulators, for the regulators in the room, when substandard things do come through, but they really need to get knocked out and sent back again, because then the circle will go back to the proponent.
Gareth, you just answered